Right, guys. Thank you very much for coming to the 10th lecture of this module. This lecture is the last one in topic 4, where we criticize traditional economic theory from the point of view of other social sciences. Lectures 9 and 8 mostly relied on psychology to try and improve economic analysis to make it more realistic. This lecture will look at mostly sociology and political science to see how the predictions of economic theory can be qualified. So we looked at the behavior of consumers, employees and managers before and saw how it departed from rational choice model. Now we're going to look at corporations, at firms as a whole, and see why they don't always just focus on narrow profit maximization. So we're going to look at it from both normative and positive perspective. We will see why we as a society don't always want corporations to maximize profit. And we'll also look at why corporations themselves choose not to do so sometimes. Just to confirm, because a couple of you guys have asked me, the content of this lecture is not going to be in the exam, so it's just for fun. Or well, it's going to be fun for me. I hope it's going to be fun for you too, because I quite like this topic. Right, so today we're looking at socially responsible business. If you're interested, here's a paper by a Nobel laureate in economics, who's actually an economic theorist and deals with subjects such as contract design, but also quite an intellectual kind of public intellectual, shall I say, who also is concerned with bigger problems such as climate change. And that's why he wrote this paper, Benabone to Roll, trying to explain corporate social responsibility from economic theory perspective. So what is corporate social responsibility and how are we going to study it from economics viewpoint? So CSR is defined as a duty of a corporation to do what it's supposed to do to create value, but do it in a certain way, in a way which protects or enhances societal assets. So you see, this definition admits that the aim of businesses is to create wealth, but it qualifies sort of the... if profit is the objective function, mathematically speaking, it specifies the constraints for this optimization problem. So we as a society, we fully realize that businesses are the only value-creating institutions because profit, which is, as you know, is equal to revenue minus cost, kind of quantifies value added, right? Because revenue is how much consumers value your goods and services, how much they're happy to pay. Cost is how much the resources which you use in producing those goods and services cost you. So the difference between the value to the consumers which you delivered and the cost to yourself which you incurred is the extra value which you created. And we owe it to corporations for making our society prosperous, so we shouldn't forget that that's the objective function. However, we, as you know, from micro and macro courses, businesses create lots of negative externalities. Most importantly, these are deadweight losses, which lack of competition creates. Whenever we say monopoly in the market, we end up overpaying for those goods and services, and we don't have enough of these goods and services provided. And also, environmental externalities are a very serious issue as well. Businesses don't fully internalize the cost they impose on natural societal resources, so this creates inefficiency. The environment is protected less than businesses themselves would like to in the long term if they want to keep existing. Corporate social responsibility, also sometimes called corporate citizenship or stakeholder management, if we look at it from positive rather than normative perspective from a perspective of the corporation themselves, why they want to do it, because they want to manage their stakeholder relationships. Or sustainability. Although sustainability refers sometimes more narrowly to the particular duty of a corporation to protect the earth. Whereas more broadly, those duties also include duties towards the labor force, the community, and other stakeholders. So as I said today, the lecture will consider normative and positive perspective. We can also separate these two perspectives in our definition of CSR, or our explanation of what CSR is. CSR can be viewed as a political ideology, which is the broadest view. So it's a worldview which prescribes how corporations should act. It's something which politicians, hopefully representing the society, think corporations should do. And as an ideology, it's used to control and legitimize business power. Business power isn't something we consider in economics, it's more of a term from other social sciences. So just to remind you, because I know some of you have taken modules on CSR, power is just a force behind an act. So that's something which makes an entity which increases their strategy set from game theory point of view, which means they have an influence on other players' payoffs. Power of corporations derives from the social contract which they implicitly signed with that society. We say, okay, we need you to create wealth, but we will allow you to exist, but in return, don't abuse societal assets, don't abuse your power by harming us as people, the signatories of this social contract. So if businesses endanger social values or the public, they lose the legitimacy. And well, this is kind of a formal raison d'être of corporations in our society. Now this was the broad view, the prescriptive view of CSR. A more narrow view is more practical or descriptive view of CSR. We know that lots of businesses spend lots of money on socially responsible activities, and they advertise them also very broadly. So there must be some practical, down-to-earth reasons to use them. And we will also look at that. We will look at how CSR can help businesses increase profit in the 21st century when the public have moved from consumerist to post-consumerist values. So as we said, that CSR is all about business power and ways how we, the public, can try and contain this power. So it's important to understand what exactly business power is and how it manifests itself. There are two levels of business power, the surface one and the deep one. So the surface level manifests itself in kind of visible changes to our lives which businesses bring. Perhaps the most dramatic one is how businesses affect us as our employers. Bankruptcy or just the closure of business can have a negative effect on communities when lots of people lose their jobs, as Tata Steel case reminds us of. That apart from this immediate or surface changes which businesses bring to our economic outcomes like this, to our cultural perceptions. For example, do you guys know where the custom of proposing with a diamond ring originated from? Yes, please? De Beers, yeah, very good. Yeah, it was invented by the biggest diamond company in the world, and they figured out they have lots of diamonds to sell, and they invented a proposal ritual. So you guys in your early 20s, you still have the power to fight against corporations and propose with something else, if you so desire. Because diamonds actually are less rare in the world than other precious stones, than rubies or sapphires. But through such inventive use of advertising, De Beers managed to convince the public they are very valuable. So this is an example of cultural power of business. So the power of business isn't only contained in its economic effects. It has lots of consequences for our culture and also for technology, because really most inventions we use today were created within businesses. Things like telephone was perfected by Bell's corporations and so on. But all these things we think about, all the things which come to mind when we think about the power of business, like unemployment versus engagement rings versus things like telephone and other inventions, they all actually represent the surface level of business power. On a deeper level, businesses transform our whole society through industrial growth. And you can, I love the picture, which is world GDP growth in the last 2 millennia. And kind of, just let's take a moment to appreciate how the fortunes of global population changed in the last 200 years. For a very, very long time, GDP growth was around zero, and then suddenly we became much richer, and as a result, healthier and happier, may I say. And this was due to business power, due to businesses transforming our society. Before we move to this search, just wanted to ask you if you guys know what happened here. Why did we have negative economic growth around 1300? What happened there? Crisis? Oh, it was a big crisis, but what was it caused by? Yeah, the production did drop a lot. But then most production was in the agricultural sector, most people were land laborers, so to speak. So for some reason we saw that we ended up with much less, well, it wasn't potato, it was before the discovery of America. So much fewer turnips being grown and lots of land neglected. So what happened here? Yes, please? The plague, yeah, very good. Lots of people died in the plague. Up to half or 60% of Europe's population died in the plague, which resulted in negative economic growth. But you see, another interesting thing is that straight after, we see something which looks like an unusual peak. Almost like the plague actually had a positive effect in the next century by increasing economic growth. Does anyone have an explanation what happened there? Yes, please?
Like a Malthusian kind of thing, that like the returns got better because there were less people.
There were less people, so each person had more resources for personal use. Yeah, that's a very, very big part of it. I think it's very important. We have fewer people, which means, yeah, there were less competition for valuable, limited land and so on. But it also had a more kind of intensive rather than extensive effect on the economy. It had a political effect on many countries, and more so in countries which suffered more from the plague. So we actually observed something of a reversal of fortune. The more damaged you were by the plague, the richer country you became later in more recent history. Can anyone suggest how it works? So, for example, England did suffer a lot from the plague. Whereas country, okay, you can only be critical about your own characteristics. So Russia didn't suffer a lot from the plague just because it's much more forested and villages are far away from each other. So it didn't really spread very quickly. So very few people died in Russia or in Eastern Europe as a whole. And somehow England ended up being a richer and more developed country in the 18th century, almost because people died. Any guesses how that happened? Well, it has to do with what you said before, right? We have much fewer people in the end, and it's about the ratio of resources, labor being one of the resources. If we have fewer people, fewer laborers, that means that their labor is now in deficit. It's in huge demand, and the landlords now had to pretty much compete with each other for laborers, and that means laborers had higher bargaining power than before. So it had a knock-on effect on basically, it empowered people actually across the class system because there were fewer of them and they were able to dictate the conditions for their relationship with the higher class. And as a result, more sort of political freedoms emerged in countries which suffered more from the plague. Because there were fewer people and they couldn't be treated by the seniors and the monarchs as just some sort of cattle material. You can see it didn't immediately result in a very, very big surge, which we start noticing around 1800. It resulted in a bit of a surge here, but kind of remained. It was above zero from then on, but kind of remained still quite low, the economic growth. However, around 1800, we see a really dramatic increase. So what happened there? Yes, please? Industrial Revolution, brilliant, exactly. We see Industrial Revolution, which also happened in this country. And it's not a coincidence. And again, the reason why it happened in this country also has to do with the reversal of fortune type of logic. Because England, around this time, or before that time, around 1700, was poorer than other countries in Western Europe, and Spain, for example, because Spain had control of wealthiest colonies in the New World. And because England was poorer, the monarch themselves were poorer, and that means they couldn't dictate their will to the people. And that's why there were, the power of Parliament and the power of everyone who wasn't a monarch in this country was much higher than, let's say, in Spain. And this power of the people unleashed something which became a much more valuable resource than gold, and this is the creative potential of basically of people here. So a funny thing happened around 1600 here, because you can disagree with me, but I think that by the law of large numbers, people in different countries are on average equally smart and creative and kind of daring, risk-taking and so on. But in countries where institutions were created or emerged, which encourage this, this creative potential of people really is fully realized. So during the reign of Elizabeth I, a very smart guy called William Lee just noticed his mother and sister spending hours and hours in the evenings hand knitting clothes. At this point, Elizabeth I issued a decree which says all her subjects have to wear a knitted cap, which increased the demand for those and increased the number of hours people spent knitting caps and other garments. And he thought, well, you only have two hands, so you can only hold two needles. So wouldn't it be great if this process was automated? So he created a machine which is called stocking frame. And he wanted to have a patent because in order to benefit from your invention, you want to patent it. And as we know, patents increase creativity because people are able to cash in on ingenuity they have. So he brought the stocking frame to Elizabeth I and asked her for a patent. And she said to him, "You're a very smart guy, you invented a great machine, but if I allow you to sell it, lots of my subjects will be out of job, out of work, because lots of them currently hand-knit garments, and this machine will make them unemployed, and this will endanger my power because it will create instability, might cause riots and so on. So she didn't give him a patent. So even though, thanks to the plague, this guy whose origins were humble, he didn't work as a laborer anymore. He had free time, thanks to that, to think about the stocking frame. But back then, Elizabeth I was still too powerful, so she could refuse patent to him. An industrial revolution didn't quite happen. But fast forward another 100 years, the powers of the monarch were significantly reduced by Parliament, and patents weren't refused on the monarch's whim anymore. And further industrial inventions enriched the inventors and changed the face of this country and this world. As you correctly said, we had industrial revolution here, which means we have explosive economic growth with a couple of dips for world wars. But since then, yeah, everyone became much wealthier and healthier, as I said. So if this explosive growth was caused by businesses, not necessarily corporations, because as we saw, those first inventors were mostly individuals, but then once industrial revolution picked off, as you know, more and more firms decided to be incorporated so that they can use, they can survive beyond their founders' finite lifespan. Yeah, this accelerated growth even further. So why is it that we dislike corporations so much, even though they're responsible for present-day prosperity? And there are reasons behind it, okay? And the main reason is that corporations by themselves, if left to their own devices, they would maximize profit, or in long term maximize wealth, which maximizes the well-being of their owners, of shareholders. But they will, and they might, and it was shown times and again in history that they will do it at the expense of other entities which affect and are affected by corporations. We call such entities stakeholders as opposed to shareholders, and those are, well, the most severely affected stakeholders are customers, employees and communities, and the government. And so we all know about terrible working conditions in 19th century factories and so on. So, and we know about terrible working conditions in some companies now in some parts of the world. So we can see that there is a certain scope for corporations to abuse their business power. The reason why we can talk about it in such strong terms, although it sounds like a value judgment, is because most corporations do have market power, meaning they are making positive profit. So if they wanted to, they could have increased the wages of their laborers, for example, but they don't often do that. This is in contrast to perfect competitors who don't have this scope, okay? So we won't have any intellectual grounds to criticize those. Most corporations are huge, and they do have power in the market where they sell, and hence also in the market where they buy labor. So we want someone to protect other stakeholders, employees, consumers. We want to protect consumers from corporations selling them low quality or unhealthy or dangerous goods, for example. We want to protect the environment from corporations polluting it. We want to protect creditors from corporations defaulting on the debts and so on. So the obvious way is to protect those stakeholders by regulation or by law. And governments do quite a lot of regulation in this sense. We know that labor law is very developed in most countries, and environmental law as well. So things like redundancy pay, for example, in this country, if you work for 2 years, you qualify for redundancy pay, or environmental taxation, or competitive regulation or antitrust regulation. They protect stakeholders. And that's the traditional, the widespread response to businesses abusing their power, not treating all stakeholders nicely. The alternative response would be for businesses themselves to take action and protect all stakeholders. So not to wait for the government to pass a law which specifies minimum wage, but instead to start voluntarily paying their workers a higher wage, or to offer other voluntary benefits to their workers, to volunteer greener technology without government asking them to, and so on. So that's what corporate responsibility really is. It's businesses themselves taking on the duty of protection towards their other stakeholders. Okay, so we got those two approaches, and in the recent decades we've seen activists really insisting on the second approach, not being taken enough, and on it being the priority one. So why is it that they say so, the activists? And the reason is that the first approach, the government regulation approach, isn't perfect. It has drawbacks. Well, first, governments may fail. In economics, because we study markets, we talk a lot about market failures, about how markets fail. But governments may fail as well. Politicians might be influenced by lobbyists and corporations themselves. Secondly, governments only have power over the territory of the country, and they're powerless when it comes to trying to enforce protection of stakeholders in other countries. No one can rule against child labor in a different country. Finally, and this is something libertarians quite like this, governments are poorly informed, because processing information and collecting information and processing it are costly. Governments don't know about the specifics in each particular firm. So from purely transaction cost point of view, it's more efficient if businesses themselves policed labor standards in their factories and improved them, rather than governments sending some sort of supervisors to make sure each and every factory doesn't employ child labor. If we could somehow make businesses do that, as a society, we would save lots of money on government regulation. That's the first reason, government failure. The second reason is that even democratically elected governments, they don't always promote everyone's values, because they have to sometimes choose difficult compromises, and the trade-offs they consider might be quite close. So the society as a whole always have broader interests than the government and the elected representatives, and they might want to campaign for those interests outside of the government regulation route. So these consumers, workers and investors whose values weren't represented by the government, they will become activists. So we considered kind of reasons for CSR. We said that we would often want businesses to volunteer protection of employees and the environment. But on the other hand, there's quite a lot of opposition to CSR from the left and the right of the spectrum. Do you guys know who the guy on the left is? The radical. Bernie Sanders, thank you very much, Wilson. So according to the radical left, and the radical is an emotionally charged word. What we mean is just more to the left than the person in the center. Do you know who is in the center, or are you too young to know this guy? Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, Gordon Brown was a Labour PM, but quite friendly to business. That's why we call him centre. So when we say radical left, we mean to the left from New Labour. Okay. So according to radical left, we can't really trust corporations to be socially responsible. It's as if we asked a wolf to act as a shepherd for sheep, right? They will just put a sort of a screen of pretense CSR over their blatant profiteering activities, and we're not going to achieve social goals. Whereas the opposition to CSR from the right comes from a different perspective. According to radical right, corporations aren't made to protect the environment and their workers. Their aim is to maximize profit, and that's what they're good at doing. Their managers are really good at doing that, and as we ourselves agreed, it's an important social goal as well. So why are we asking them to do something they're not good at? Charities would be much better at deciding which causes need supporting, and so on. So you see, neither radical left nor radical right really likes CSR. It's only broad centre, such as Gordon Brown, who wants to work with businesses and saying, okay guys, we won't tax you too much, but in return, please try and not use child labour, and so on. So do you know who is the person on the right? Very good, thank you. Yeah, that's Milton Friedman. He's the only dead person here, I think. Yeah. So I'm glad you know him, even though he was active slightly before you guys were born. So Milton Friedman, he was a very vocal critic of CSR. He said that, well, he famously said that it's strange to assume that businesses have responsibility, because you and I have responsibilities, but you know, this room doesn't have responsibility. The university doesn't have responsibility. It's us who can decide that we're responsible for like the poor in our society and do something about it. We can't make an entity responsible. This view isn't very popular these days, actually. And the reason why it's not very popular is because several recent trends made CSR a much more widely accepted practice. Well, first, as I said, the era of consumerist values is coming to an end. As societies grow richer, we're kind of moving upwards Maslow pyramid, and we now care less about satisfying our basic needs, sometimes at the expense of the environment, and more about the well-being of our society as a whole. These new values are known as post-materialist values. And they did change consumer attitudes a lot. And this is why business strategies such as fair trade are very profitable, because consumers are happy to sacrifice their money to serve the greater good. The second reason why CSR became a much more accepted practice is because of transparency in the world. So thinkers of the 20th century were afraid of the big brother, but it turns out that there's not one single centralized big brother. We all turned into big brothers now. Now the transparency goes both ways. Not only are our actions more visible to those in the position of power, it's the other way around as well. We now know much more about what corporations do. We know much more about what politicians think. That's why it creates an illusion that politicians are much dumber than they used to be. But before we couldn't read their mind, right? We couldn't hear what they say to each other next to the water cooler. And now we read their Twitter, and now it became really exposed what they really think. But they probably were just as had such just as strong beliefs before as they do now. We just weren't exposed to them. So this transparency mean that we now can police corporations doing naughty things, including naughty things abroad, and really hold them accountable to them. Moreover, as corporations grew bigger, even though concentration of business now isn't quite as strong as at the turn of the 20th century, when, for example, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the oil market. It's not the case anymore for Standard Oil's successors. Still, corporations do have greater effects on the environment and the society than they did 200 years ago, let's say. And this, coupled with many countries competing with each other for foreign direct investment and relaxing environmental and labor standards as part of this competition, it resulted in quite a lot of very serious catastrophes happening in the world because of companies neglecting the environment and labor rights. Moreover, the long-run effects of global warming became much more obvious than before. So these four reasons together mean that CSR, well, the companies are expected to do much more CSR than before and volunteer to do that. Speaking of the last point, the atmospheric pollution, so you can see that the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is growing at an accelerating rate. And the rate of pollution deaths is quite high in many countries. So what can we say? Looking at the countries at the very top of this chart, countries with the highest level of pollution deaths, where do you reckon this pollution comes from? What kind of pollution is it? What is that so special about those countries? Well, take Bangladesh, for example.
They're all coastal.
Coastal, it's a very interesting point. Yeah, so how does it affect pollution?
Maybe seaports. Water pollution.
That's a very good point. I haven't thought about it. I guess it affects the way how air moves away from the sea into the land, and so you don't get your gases blown away. Instead, you get them inland, right?
But some of them are not. So.
Yeah, what other factors affect this? What do you think? So pollution deaths are premature deaths, I think. So it's when you die earlier than you would otherwise if you weren't breathing this air. So Bangladesh is a say again? Water pollution. Yeah, very good point. So who pollutes water? Yes, please. Factory, yeah, very good. So Bangladesh is a highly industrialized country with lots and lots of, with a very big proportion of its GDP coming from the industry. And so you see, this must be effluent and emissions from factories. Whereas for some of the countries down the list, we might conjecture that it might be indoor pollution from just using open fire to heat up your home, which actually is the first cause of pollution deaths around the world. Causes many more deaths than industrial pollution. So you see, the UK is doing all right compared to people with the highest proportion of death from pollution. But unfortunately, if you compare it to the countries which are at the bottom of the list, so these are the countries which have the lowest proportion of pollution-related deaths, the first 10, and then we have US and UK for reference. And the UK isn't doing that great, actually doing worse than the US, and worse than many European countries here, Scandinavia and so on. Any explanations why the UK isn't doing as well as Norway, Iceland, Finland, Sweden? You would think the UK isn't an industrial country anymore as much as it used to be. So it wouldn't be Bangladesh type reason. Actually, I think this number for the UK is higher than for most of Western Europe, not just those leaders in clean air. Apparently it's diesel cars. So maybe it's not the worst policy to phase out diesel cars. Right, so we looked at why... Oh, by the way, guys, before I go on, can we have a vote over the structure of this lecture? Do we want to have a break now and come back? Or do we want to not have a break and finish earlier? Break. Okay, shall we have a break and come back here at 5 p.m. and look at the rest of the lecture? Thank you. Hello.
Can I ask, like, is this lecture is not examinable? No?
No, it's not going to be an exam.
Oh, so this just for like the extension. Like,
Yeah, it's to see how else I can behavioral economics can
yes, and no will be in the real exam this year.
No,
That's good.
yeah. Basically because, well, it's not in the seminars, right? So I don't want to
It's not in the
examine
seminar,
you
yeah.
on whatever's not in the seminar. I wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, so
No, I mean-
all the exam will be based on like all the knowledge in the first 9 lectures and the seminars as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Cool, but thank you. Yeah. Right. Shall we look at the rest of the lecture? Thank you very much to people who stayed on after 5 p.m. Appreciate it. If you had to go again, not a problem. So we've just considered why the society demands businesses to be socially responsible. There are reasons why government regulation doesn't always work, because governments may fail, because government doesn't represent everyone, and that's why we sometimes would ask businesses to do their share of protection of the vulnerable. And we also said that modern day concerns make it both more urgent and easier to police corporations. However, many businesses engage in CSR before they feel that pressure from activists and the society as a whole. And there are 3 reasons for that. One is that CSR can be viewed as a strategy for long-term profit maximization. If you destroy the environment, then the businesses will go down with it. So maybe if you try and protect it, you will maximize your long-term profit as a result. Environment isn't the only example. You can think of all the excess purchases of derivatives and other financial instruments as being one of the reasons behind the global financial crisis of 2008. And you would think that this short-sighted profit maximization many traders and investment banks pursued backfired and resulted in them losing money themselves. So sometimes it's good to care about the common good because you are part of that common. Secondly, businesses engage in CSR kind of on behalf of their owners. As you know, the richest people in the world are also the world's greatest philanthropists. People like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos do pledge a lot of money to charity. So they might as well do it not directly but through their corporations. Milton Friedman would be very unhappy if Bill Gates forced Microsoft to engage in charitable work on his behalf. But there are reasons why actually it is a good idea. That's because corporations, they often have resources which make charitable work easier to implement compared to individuals. I mean, they have this network of branches around the world. They have contacts with communities and local people and so on. So there are reasons why delegated philanthropy is more efficient than direct philanthropy. So you can see the real origin of this, the delegated philanthropy, is individual social responsibility of owners. Now this needs to be differentiated from managers, not the people who own the corporations, but those who run it. If they start spending shareholders' money on charity, this is a corporate governance problem. It's not their money, so we might suspect something isn't going quite right there. So this insider-initiated corporate philanthropy would probably not be so welcome, not just by Milton Friedman, but by Jean Tirole and other modern economic theorists. It's a serious issue, and yeah, we can't view it as benign. Now, okay, so looking at one of those 3 reasons in more detail, at individual social responsibility, and on its behalf, why is it that Bill Gates wants to give money away to improve primary education? Well, there might be 3 reasons for it. Either he's just He just cares about young children around the world, and wants them to do well. Maybe he gets some tax breaks from engaging in charitable work. Or maybe he is just vain. He wants the world to see him as the world's greatest philanthropist. And unfortunately, the last reason seems to be the most salient and the most potent one. Only 1% of all charitable donations in the world are anonymous, which means people do care about social image when they give to charity. Not only social image, but self-image also matters. So maybe it's even less than 1% that is driven by pure altruism. So one way to really test those explanations against each other is a so-called dictator game. It's not really a game because only one player is active, but you might have heard about it in micro, right? We give half of the participants £10 each in this experimental laboratory, and then they're matched anonymously with another half, so each person with 10 quid, called a dictator, is matched with the recipient, and then they decide how much out of this 10 quid to give away. You would think it's anonymous, so it would be pure altruism behind the giving, but as we will see in the next slide, it's not quite as simple. The really crazy thing is that people give money away to strangers when no one can identify who they were. So most people give away 30% of the sum, or around 30%, as this iconographic from 600 participants. So it's a meta-study, so it wasn't one experiment with 600 people. They just drew results from many different experiments and analyzed them. Yeah, and in many experiments, giving away half was a modal choice. So to check whether it's genuine altruism or image concerns, a twist on the design was performed for this experiment. So in this slightly changed game, people who would play the role of the dictator if the game carried on, they were given a sort of pre-choice. Either we proceed as intended, we give you 10 quid, you decide how much to give to the other person, and the other person gratefully accepts. Or instead, we just give you 9 quid, and you walk away, and the other person never knows that the game could have taken place. And a lot of people chose to walk away with 9 quid. Even though they could have chosen to play the game, still keep £9, give £1 to the other person, no one would be worse off, someone else would be better off. But no, they just didn't want to be perceived as mean by giving someone 1 quid. So lots of people chose to walk away with 9 quid. That means those people aren't genuine altruists. The proportion of these people varies. I think it's between 20 and 50% in different experiments, but you can see it's a significant proportion. Even in this highly anonymized environment, where you would think it's not about image because no one knows who you are, still self-image matters. There are also field observations or empirical data confirming the same kind of logic, that people tend to give more blood when they're given medals for donation, not just medal which you keep, medal which then local newspaper writes about. And apparently postal vote has lower turnout than real vote, because you can't show off to your neighbors that you're a good citizen by voting by post. And also, interestingly, solar batteries are a more popular energy-saving measure in many areas than wall insulation, because, again, it showcases how environmentally friendly you are, even though wall insulation is actually more effective in saving energy. And, of course, glamorous causes such as museums and concert halls attract more donations than the poor.
So why do you think that's an example of social image concern?
The last one.
Because I'd argue it's more that like people are more willing to give to things they're passionate about, and like other people then tend to come under that.
Yeah, that could be an alternative.
Got £1 billion, whereas like it's not that important, of course, but it's like kind of like a thing of kind of society's beauty. It's like an intangible thing that people want to give to more, because I feel like they value it more. I don't think it's through self-image. It might be a bit, I don't know. I wouldn't say it's mainly one. We go to museums.
It's a very good point. Yeah. So you mean they want to have this kind of lasting effect in the society? So when you build a museum, it will stay, and if you give money to the poor, they will spend it?
Yeah, I just feel like maybe because it has a more personal resonance to whoever's donating. It's like everyone does appreciate the arts and like music and things like that, whereas it's harder for humans to relate to people that you've never seen before.
Oh, so they kind of, they just personally enjoy classical music, and that's why they gift it.
Of like how people value things.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we could possibly design an experiment to try and estimate the relative inputs, because actually my next slide I think relates to it. When you give to museums and concert halls, they often put a plaque with your name. So if we could compare how much people give to museums with a plaque, with a museum without a plaque, and to the poor, I guess that's how we could. Because what you're saying is people would still give more to museums even if there was no such philanthropic. Yeah, that's. I'm pretty sure we could collect data because not all donors receive this.
Yeah, it's just like Notre Dame. Like I think that's a good example. Like there weren't like thousands of plaques put around it.
Perhaps not. Yeah.
There might be. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more of an American thing to have a plaque everywhere, including your coat room. That's what the thing says. No, that's very valid concern. Yeah. Critical mind will help you guys in part D of your exam questions, where you have to. By the way, I'm going to upload the mock today. I'm sorry I haven't done it before. So looking at all this, how we as a society or as a government representing the society can use this knowledge to increase charitable donations. Obviously, we want to encourage people to do good by giving them medals and so on, but we don't want to over give medals because then we don't want people to suspect that others suspect them to have this non-altruist consideration. So things like very shall I say, so not a sacrifice, because usually it's very rich people who give money. Very influential act perhaps doesn't need additional encouragement because it already is something which makes you stand out by itself. Again, we probably don't need to encourage people to do some common courtesy type things like cleaning after their dog, because again, the social stigma around it is already strong enough. But for the acts in the middle, where you see this dip in the picture, not quite heroic, but not quite, barely respectable. We do want to give medals. We want to give people medals for giving blood. We don't want to give them medals for pledging all of their wealth to charity, because it's a medal by itself. And we don't want to give them medals for cleaning after their dog. I guess that's the conclusion. Okay, so that concludes the normative part of our analysis of CSR, when we looked at why is it that we want businesses to engage in it and how we can encourage them. Now, sometimes businesses engage in CSR voluntarily, so that's the positive part of the CSR. Let's see why they do it. And the reason is that socially responsible behavior has concrete benefits. It has marketing, HR, and operational benefits. Marketing benefits mostly have to do with consumers having post-materialist values. and you can earn more money if you sell fair trade. For example, a couple of years ago, a clothes producer, Patagonia, raised £10 million on Black Friday by promising to donate 100% of its sales to environmental causes. Of course, you can't earn very much money if you donate 100% of your revenue to environmental causes, but it just shows the potential magnitude of this effect. People were buying, even though the prices for the people didn't change compared to last year, they bought 5 times more from Patagonia because it cared about the environmental cause. In terms of the HR dimension, being a responsible business results in your staff being more loyal and more motivated. And finally, it can also save you some money. Well, for example, if you use some greener technologies, not all of them because many of them are very expensive, but some technologies which save water, for example, you will also save yourself some cost. So the example here is Nike, who invested in a water-free dyeing process and saved a lot of money because they didn't need to dry the trainers after dyeing them. And of course was good for the environment as well. So CSR has benefits. So the next question we ask is, how do you decide where to spend, on which exact charitable activities to spend your very limited resources? That's where Milton Friedman comes back and says, I told you, you will not know exactly how to do that, because businesses aren't good at deciding on the targets for charity. But since Friedman said that, other people tried to help businesses solve this problem and came up with a grid known as a Mendeley grid. It basically helps businesses structure their stakeholders and see which ones are the ones which they really need to satisfy. You can, as we said, that corporate social responsibility is also called stakeholder management. And that's because if you don't engage in CSR, you might suffer because your stakeholders will be unhappy with you, and if they're powerful enough, they can make your life hard. So the power is not just legal power, mostly it's market power. So, for example, government is quite a powerful stakeholder because it can pass laws or regulate you as a business. But equivalently, your consumers are a very powerful stakeholder. Even though they don't have legal power, they can just stop buying your goods. They can boycott you if you're an oil company which caused an oil spill in the Mexican Gulf. They can just stop using your petrol stations and you will suffer. So we want to care about the powerful stakeholders and also about those who are interested in us. Yes, please. Well, yeah, you will have a CSR strategy which in an ideal world would be aligned with your business strategy. Sorry, that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe you can put CSR
into your business model. So that's sort of, you mean at the very beginning of developing your business plan, you could...
Yeah, maybe it's more like financial structure. So for example, like maybe you can contribute like 10% of your sales for a CSR fund. So instead of maybe like budget every single time like CSR corporate actions. So I think it's safe firms time as well.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, I think this approach more fits when you decide to spend this much on CSR, and once you decided it, you need to choose a particular cause, and that's what would help you to do that. But yeah, you might as well just do it one step before. So when you're choosing between causes, because you know economics is all about satisfying unlimited needs with limited resources, you need to think about several things. If your stakeholders have conflicting demands, of course you want to try and prioritize them, see which unhappy stakeholders are more dangerous for you, for your reputation and business. If you are part of a value chain, as many of our well-known corporations experienced themselves. You want to try and mitigate adverse effects which other companies on your value chain create. Otherwise, you will be held responsible for them. You'll be held responsible for your suppliers using child labor, even if you yourself as Nike don't use it. Finally, because as we said, lots of charitable activity is motivated by reputation concerns, you really want to pick quite a big social issue if you can. Yeah, like museum versus helping the poor. And you want to pick the one which is aligned with your competitive advantage. By this we mean two things. One is aligned in the sense that helping with this issue will help you. For example, it's not surprising that Unilever chose improving health and hygiene as their prioritized issue, because they mostly sell kind of small disposable goods. So if everyone in the society, in the community, is slightly healthier and as a result slightly richer, they will buy more of Unilever products in the end. But also it's aligned with their competitive advantage in another way. It's something which Unilever have resources to achieve, because they produce health and hygiene products. So let's finish our lecture with a case study of Coca-Cola, which got some very, very bad press about 15 years ago, when a non-governmental organization called Center for Science and Environment discovered that it's in the beverages it sells in India, it has a very high level of pesticides, exceeding European standards. After this report was published, the government undertook tests, and they showed that, yeah, the level of pesticides is quite high, but actually it's safe under local standards, so we're not going to take any legal action against Coca-Cola, said the Indian government. So Coca-Cola thought, oh, maybe we're okay, because our most powerful stakeholder isn't angry with us, but not so fast. The consumers, despite lacking legal power, they really caused a lot of damage to Coca-Cola reputation. Because of the boycott, the effective boycott of their production, their sales dropped 40% in India. And across the world, sales declined by 15%, because actually students in the US and Europe joined the boycott and stopped buying Coca-Cola products. Students are usually forced for change for the better in many of those case studies. So let's suppose that this happened just rather than 15 years ago, and let's try and advise Coca-Cola on the best course of action. First thing they need to do, they need to draw a mental grid, see which of their stakeholders they really need to try and comfort. So Indian government is powerful but doesn't really care about this particular issue, whereas the NGO cares a lot but they don't have any power. And we have consumers who both care and have power. They have buying power, which they can refuse us. So it's consumers who Coca-Cola really wanted to please. So in order to improve its reputation and sales as a result, Coca-Cola should actively try and seek and resolve social problems, be proactive in their approach to CSR, and communicate what they did to consumers and communities. So the advice here would be to voluntarily bring the content of the drinks in compliance with stricter standards. And also, as we said, it's good to show that you care about bigger issues. So Coca-Cola should choose a big issue in sort of in line with its competitive advantage. You might have heard about Sustainable Development Goals, the big problems which we, the world population, need to overcome. So just looking at these pictures, which one did you think Coca-Cola chose to engage with, which has to do with their competitive advantage? Just judging by the picture, which one do you think goes best with Coca-Cola? Yeah, very good. Clean water and sanitation. Because they use lots of water in production and because they are a drinks company. What they did, they created Coca-Cola Clean Water Foundations in India. And that really improved their reputation as a result. Right, I think that's it. Thank you very much for sticking with me, and I hope you have a good week, and I'm looking forward to having the final lecture with you next Monday. Yep, thank you very much. The name of this non-governmental organization. Oh, that's sorry. We have somebody there. Could you Center for Science and Environment? Yeah. Sorry. Good job. Yes. This tells you what to do with stakeholders who fall into one of these 4 quadrants. Very powerful, but not very interested, should be satisfied. The government, whatever minimum standard it gives you, just satisfy them. Don't think twice. Not powerful, not interested, just kind of keep a loose eye on that, don't worry. These guys, very interested, powerful, keep informed. Yeah, we need to tell the NGO that they're doing good things, but we don't need to do anything more than that. It's not powerful anyway, a non-governmental organization. So these are the activists. Yeah, and these are the most dangerous potential stakeholders. Very powerful, very interested. We need to manage them very closely. Really work with consumer focus groups to see what they want and satisfy it very as full as you can. Thank you.